Chapter 59, The Dreamers, Hanyu's POV. Hanyu was back in the temple for some reason, and he'd lost Antony. Lord Marcus was navigating the corridors towards him. He didn't know how he knew that, but he did, and Hanyu couldn't get away because the high priest had cornered him and was making him recite lessons and show off waiting positions and dance moves. No matter how many times Hanyu tried to explain that he had already been chosen, the severe older man wouldn't listen. "It's not enough to be chosen," the high priest snapped at him. "You must be perfectly pleasing every day, not just on the day of your selection. Have you been perfectly pleasing, Hanyu? Have you been obedient?" Hanyu squirmed. "I've been obedient enough." "If you were obedient, you'd remember the words to Lord Antony crowns King Shinji. Go on, recite it. If you can't, then we'll have to take you back. We can't allow a subpar offering to remain with the Lord of the Gods." Hanyu was rocked by the horror of the idea. He couldn't imagine anything worse than being dragged back to the temple. Even the thought was so stifling it felt like being tied up. On the ships, his world might be largely restricted to Antony's rooms, Lord Theodora's rooms, and the upper deck, but in each of those places he was allowed to speak freely. He could be the center of attention sometimes, not because he was in trouble, but simply because he was liked and his talents were applauded. The idea of returning to the broad halls and wide courtyards of the temple was immediately suffocating. "Go on," the high priest urged. Hanyu stammered and fumbled, words dropping out of his mind like they were greased. Lord Marcus was coming closer and closer, and at any moment the high priest was going to give Hanyu to him. Or was it Antony who was going to give him away, as he'd threatened? Either way, Hanyu was failing, and he would never see his Antony again. "Hanyu? Come on, pet, wake up." Hanyu was about to apologize to the priest when he realized that it was Antony's voice, and a hand on his shoulder, and his eyes were closed. And he was in bed. It had only been a dream. Hanyu blinked drowsily up at Antony. The god stared back down at him, and perhaps the darkness deceived Hanyu's eyes, but he would have sworn that his master looked concerned over his silly nightmare. Antony's hair tumbled loose and tangled around his shoulders, so pale it almost seemed to glow in the darkness, which made him look even softer. Hanyu lunged forward and pressed his face against Antony's chest. Even through his nightshirt, the god's chilly skin felt wonderful against his hot, teary face. Antony stiffened, but his arms settled around Hanyu's shoulders anyway. "Nightmare?" he asked, and even his voice was gentler than usual. Hanyu nodded into his chest. The high priest was going to take me away from you." The god's arms tightened around him. "That could never happen," Antony said firmly. "I know I scared you today, but I promise you won't be forced. If anyone tried to take you away from me without your consent, they wouldn't even live long enough to realize what a bad idea that was. You'll only leave me when you want to go." Hanyu shook his head, not caring how the movement smashed his nose, and clutched his master even tighter. "Never. I'll never want to leave you." "Well then, it's not an issue," Antony said. "No one can take you from me, especially not that vicious pissant of a priest." Hanyu might ordinarily have been shocked or delighted by this description of a man who had once been the most powerful person in his world. At the moment, though, his heart didn't have room for more than one feeling, and that feeling was happiness at being held so tightly. He relaxed into Antony's arms with a blissful little sigh, savoring the way the god ran his hands lightly up and down his back. The caress was so slow and rhythmic that Hanyu wondered if it might be unconscious. Just in case, he made sure to hold perfectly still so as not to disrupt his master's movement. Hanyu basked in Antony's words. Not only has he agreed to keep me, he'd fight anyone who wanted to take me. The idea was thrilling. He knew he would spend many future nights lulling himself to sleep with elaborate fantasies of Antony rescuing him from armies of kidnappers. Fantasies of how he would repay his deliverer were less likely to put him to sleep, but would be equally pleasant, he was sure. Well, Antony had spared him enough times that it was more or less the same thing. Why not repay him now? Antony meant to keep him. Surely that meant he intended to bed him. Anyhow, he was already bedding him, in a sense. Would he have invited Hanyu to share his bed and let him be naked in it if he didn't mean to use him sooner or later? And he had been with humans before, and even fallen in love with them, so why not now? Antony had told him about his life, about his loves and his pain, a staggering intimacy that Hanyu still couldn't quite believe he'd been granted. And his master had been so soft and attentive after his story, fixing his hair and drawing him and letting Hanyu touch him. He was even softer now as he cradled him. Hanyu had never felt so close to anyone, not even a sow. Hanyu snuggled a little nearer. Antony's loose hair tickled at his skin, and the god's hand was still stroking his bare back. He breathed in Antony's scent, seawater, lemon, the faintest metallic hint of blood, Hanyu's own blood, taken with his lips on Hanyu's throat, and felt his whole body going tense and hot with excitement. There would never be a better time. Perhaps it would be more proper to await his master's command, but Antony never seemed to mind his eagerness in any other sphere. Hanyu trailed his fingers over the god's leg. "Did I wake you?" His voice was a little breathy, but he kept it level enough that Antony didn't seem to notice anything amiss. "Well, yes, but that's all right," the god soothed. Hanyu lifted his head so that it rested on Antony's shoulder, his lips almost brushing his master's neck as he spoke. "Still, I'm very sorry. It was terribly ill-mannered of me. How can I make it up to you that you're stuck with such a useless attendant?" "Don't be stupid, boy." Did Antony have the slightest inkling of how tender his voice sounded as he spoke those familiar, curmudgeonly words? Did he realize that he always said them in reassurance? Did he have any idea how treasured Hanyu felt every time he received that gruff comfort? All his life, Hanyu's teachers and even his friends had taken it as a matter of course that he was stupid. Dear, good-natured, stupid Hanyu, who couldn't concentrate or hold still or restrain his thoughts or control his emotions. It had never occurred to him to mind. It was just a fact of life. Hanyu was stupid like he was blonde. He just was. Antony said it like it was a choice, like Hanyu was perfectly capable of not being stupid. And he didn't use that phrase when Hanyu was chattering or failing to learn dance steps or forgetting his manners. He said, "Don't be stupid," when Hanyu said that Antony deserved a better offering, when he worried that he was annoying the god, when he said that he should be punished. Every time Hanyu questioned his worthiness, he got the same gruff reassurance. He loved the words. He loved the idea of getting to be something more than sweet, stupid Hanyu. He loved this beautiful, cranky man who cradled him so close and made him feel, for the first time in his life, that every one of his traits was seen, and not just tolerated, but wanted. The kiss he pressed to Antony's neck wasn't nibbly and teasing like he'd planned. He was too lost in love and gratitude for that. He just pressed his mouth to the god's skin, frank and joyful in his affection. Antony's flesh felt just as strange and wonderful against Hanyu's lips as he had always imagined. It was chilly, soft, magical. It was perfect. He showered him with ecstatic little kisses, drunk on the feeling and the closeness. Besides, as long as Hanyu's lips were busy on the god's suddenly stiff neck, they couldn't spill the words that pressed harder every day to escape them. "I love you, Antony." Antony's POV. Antony was awakened from his own dream by the sounds of Hanyu's. He bolted upright with a moan, then immediately clapped his hand over his mouth, but a glance showed that the gesture was unnecessary. Hanyu slept on, twisting and groaning in the sheets he'd stolen from Antony. Antony squeezed his eyes shut and tried to cling to the edges of the dream, which was pathetic. It had been a nightmare, for fuck's sake. He'd had an enormous gaping cut on his chest, and Sana and Julia had been cleaning it. Julia had given Sana the needle and watched proudly as they began putting Antony together with tiny, neat stitches. Sana's face had been scrunched tight in concentration as they worked, their tongue poking out just a little in that way they had. Antony had struggled desperately to open his own mouth and warn Sana. He wanted to fling himself at their feet and plead for forgiveness, to wrap his arms around their soft waist and cling there forever, and more than anything to scream at them and warn them to stay away from him. He couldn't do anything. He could only lie there helplessly and watch his doomed love at work, and it had been awful and torturous, and Antony didn't want to let it go. "Please, please don't go." He'd already been crying when he woke, and then he doubled over with his hands over his eyes and let a few more tears splash onto his palms as Hanyu whimpered beside him. Like any child of a royal court, he had practice with quickly getting a hold of himself, and the unhappy thrashing from the middle of the bed only hurried the process. It was unconscionable to leave Hanyu to suffer just because Antony was miserable and didn't want to talk to anybody. He scrubbed the tears from his face and turned to his moaning offering. Hanyu's sleeping face was drawn into a deep grimace, and that, combined with his whimpers, to tear at Antony's already bleeding heart. His first shake was so gentle that it didn't even disrupt the boy's breathing. His voice, when he finally found it, was almost a croon. "Hanyu? Come on, pet, wake up." When Hanyu opened his eyes and saw him, his face lit up with joy and relief so powerful that Antony felt he might be blinded, dark cabin or no. Then the boy lunged forward and clung to him, and that was all right. He might still feel the urge to flee and lick his wounds in private, but it was nice to feel needed. A wave of protectiveness washed through him, and Antony didn't try to push it down. Succumbing to the desire to shield the trembling boy, Antony curled around Hanyu and kept tracing his back. The boy's warmth soaked into his own wretched, chilly skin and soothed his shredded nerves just a little. He wondered if it would be too much of an indulgence to hold Hanyu until he drifted back to sleep. He noticed when Hanyu's voice went low and throaty, but he attributed it to the returning sleepiness and didn't worry. He didn't even sense danger when Hanyu all but purred. "How can I make it up to you that you're stuck with such a useless attendant?" "Don't be stupid, boy," he chided. Even before the words were out of his mouth, he knew that they were wrong. Hanyu was 21 years old, a very young man, to be sure, but still a man. A kind, sweet-natured man who, miraculously, found some kind of comfort in Antony's wicked arms and offered comfort to him in return. Why did Antony always avoid thinking of him that way? Then Antony wasn't thinking at all, because that man's lips were dropping eager little kisses all over his neck. Hanyu's lips were dry and chapped from sleep. His breath was shockingly warm. There should have been nothing special about the sensation, but it jolted down Antony's spine like a lightning strike. He went rigid in Hanyu's clinging arms, but reminded himself not to shove. It hurts his feelings when I push him away. "Hanyu," he said carefully, "what are you doing?" His voice was tight and strained. It cracked as he stammered the last word. If Antony's heart had been capable of beating, he was sure it would have been battering at his ribs. The shower of kisses continued for a moment longer before Hanyu could bring himself to pull away. "I love my life here with you," his offering finally breathed against his throat. "It feels so good when you hold me like this. I want to make you feel good too, Antony." How would Antony have received this at any other moment? Had his heart been less raw and shredded from revelations and nightmares, would he have been tempted? He would never have let it go any further, of course, but would he have wanted it to? Right now, there was no temptation except a sudden urge to start crying again. "That isn't necessary." Antony was relieved to find that his tone was sufficiently gruff to cover his sudden tearfulness. As Hanyu peppered his neck with more kisses, all Antony could think was, why couldn't we just keep holding each other? It took a moment, but Antony finally grated out, "That's enough." The quiver in his voice could easily have passed for anger, he thought. Hanyu must have thought so too, because he pulled back. Finally. Hanyu's face was a picture of hurt and confusion. Antony shut his eyes against the sight and took a few breaths to collect himself. His thumb rubbed over and over at the tiny callus just under his ring finger. After what felt like an hour, he was sure he could speak without breaking down. "Go back to sleep, Hanyu," he said. "You have your above-deck exercises tomorrow. I'm going up for some air." He barely heard the tremulous, "Yes, my lord," that followed. He was in such a hurry to get into the washroom and shut the door between himself and his offering. Hanyu's eyes, his voice, his touch, they all made it too difficult to shut out the memories that threatened to tear Antony apart. He yanked violently at his hair as he braided it. He'd accidentally torn out quite a few strands by the time he was done, but in the end he regarded himself in the mirror and felt better. He looked calm and put together. Once he was dressed, there was no longer any sign of turmoil in any aspect of his appearance. Even as he fled, he was ashamed of himself. Imagine, a person of his age getting so flustered because of a dream, and then crying because somebody wanted sex. He was ridiculous. But he still needed to get out of here, now. He marched back through the bedroom without a single glance at Hanyu and put his boots on rather more noisily than he would have ordinarily done, then opened the door. Theodora was standing in the hallway with her hand raised to knock. Her cheeks were wet, and her broad shoulders shook with sobs.